So this is the second half of a lecture on evolution. And just to start off, I'm going to re-summarize some of the key points from the previous lecture, and then we're going to go into some evidence that is in support of evolution. So first of all, the definition of evolution is a change in a species over time, meaning many, many generations. And the mechanism by which species evolve is known as natural selection. And during natural selection, those organisms with traits that will make them the most fit or the best at surviving and reproducing will persist. And the beneficial traits, or the traits that make these offspring more fit to survive and reproduce, will continue to stay in that population over time. In order for natural selection to happen, variation is required, and a lot of that variation comes from mutations as well as through sexual reproduction. There are some other mechanisms by which evolution can happen in addition to natural selection or survival of the fittest, and two of those are listed here, and they're genetic drift and gene flow. So there is some evidence for evolution, the first of which is sort of looking back through the fossil record. And so we can see sort of a modern day horse up here at the top, and then its evolutionary ancestor here at the bottom. And what you can see, and what scientists have seen by looking through the fossil record, is that there is similarities in not only the shapes, but also the sizes of bones or fossils. And so by looking through the fossil record, you can actually see changes from an older ancestor to more modern ancestors. And the fossil record provides some evidence that these small changes between this old ancestor and the current horse we see today have happened over time, right? And you can actually monitor these changes or these small differences by looking at bones from different time periods. Additionally, you can use anatomy as well as bones in a different way, and you can look at what are known as homologous structures. Homologous structures are just structures that share the same basic form because they've descended from a common ancestor. And so here you can see these bones of a whale flipper colored in different colors. And they're kind of equivalent or homologous bones in birds' wings, dogs' legs, and human arms can be seen in the same colors. And so we can actually see that this orange bone here, for example, in birds, is homologous to this orange bone here in human arms. And these structures are these similar structures that have similar shapes and functions is another piece of evidence for evolution from basically a more primitive life form in the form of a whale to birds to dogs and humans. And these structures have been retained through and modified slightly through evolution, right? But they still exist because they have a common ancestor, common bone in sort of this older evolutionary organism that's retained its shape and same function and its homology in higher organisms. So we can use the fossil record as well as kind of anatomy to provide some evidence for evolution. And another anatomical structure that supports the idea that species have been changing over time is the idea of this vestigial structure. And what a vestigial structure is just a physical structure that's present in an organism that has no real function. And the presence of these vestigial structures indicates that there was probably a function to this structure in an earlier ancestor that is no longer necessary in this organism. And so you can see an example of what are known as vestigial legs on the bottom of a snake. And as we know, snakes do not have functional legs. They can move without those appendages, but they still have legs left over from their prior evolutionary ancestor, which would have been the amphibians. And so the legs don't have a structure for snakes or apparent function for snakes, but they used to in an earlier ancestor. And the same thing is observed in humans. And so we've all heard that our appendix is no longer necessary and it can be easily removed. And it's likely that in earlier organisms, the appendix did have some kind of function, but now it's just a physical organ that humans don't really need anymore. But it was probably important to one of our evolutionary ancestors. Additionally, if we look at the study of embryos or embryology and the study of organisms as they develop, you start to see things that might not be as apparent in adults. And so originally we looked for evidence for evolution in ways that we could kind of easily see, like bones that were dug up as well as other fossils. We could look at anatomy or anatomical structures, like those vestigial structures or homologous structures. And then once technology evolved, we could actually start to look at embryos. And we could compare embryos of different organisms and see more similarities in them than we might be able to see physically in an adult. For example, we can actually see gill slits in all vertebrates, including humans. And we obviously know we do not have gills, but our evolutionary ancestors did. And this presence of gill slits that ultimately close up and become lungs is one argument for evolution. And in addition, what I'd like you to note is that there are 5 embryos in this picture, all of which are different organisms. And I would like you to take a second and kind of guess which one of these 5 different embryos is the human one. So I'm not sure how many of you are right, but this one here is actually the human. I was thinking it was more like this one because you could sort of see a head shape. That one is actually a rabbit embryo. You can see a chicken embryo, as well as a salamander embryo here on the far left and a fish embryo on the far right. And what you'll notice, especially between the human, rabbit, and chicken, there is very little distinction between these embryos, and only a true embryologist could probably make those distinctions. And so the fact that these 3 organisms, all of which happen to be kind of higher order vertebrates, either in the bird class or the class of mammals, actually have really similar structures, even that we might not see once they become adults, which argues once again for the idea of evolution. And finally, there's this idea of biogeography, which also supports some evidence for evolution. And biogeography would argue that there are some groups of organisms that evolved or changed before the continents broke apart, and so now we can see those groups and we could see those groups that evolved before the continents broke apart all over the world, whereas groups that evolved after may only appear in certain regions. And so we all know that originally all of the continents were actually one supercontinent, now known as Pangaea. And over the past kind of history of the Earth, the continents have moved into this pattern we recognize here today. And so one type of organism that evolved before the continents broke apart is actually this group of birds known as the ratites, which include both ostriches and emus, so those large flightless birds. And what biogeography would argue is that it would be almost impossible for these organisms to appear and look so similar to each other if they all didn't originate from the same point. And what you'll notice in this map up here is that South America, Africa, and as well as Australia were once quite close to each other, and that includes India here. And so what evidence for what the evolutionary biologists would argue is that the ratite birds, or these large birds like ostriches and emus, evolved in a single event, and then they were living on both South America, Africa, and then this area here before the continents broke apart. And then once they did, you can see that their distribution has changed. So all the birds are generally the same, and they have had slight changes probably in response to their environment, so they may have evolved to slightly different species, but overall they evolved from a common ancestor before the continents broke apart, and then continued evolving slightly to account for the changes afterwards. these things are kind of nice pieces of evolutionary evidence, right? So we can look at fossils, we can look at the anatomy of organisms, and we can make comparisons between homologous structures like a dog's arm and a human's arm. We can look at vestigial structures, we can look at biogeography as well as embryology, and all of those things are great, right? But the most compelling evidence for evolution really didn't happen until much more recently with the advent of molecular biology, and once we discovered that DNA is the genetic material for all living things. And so we know that all living things use DNA as their genetic material, from the single-celled E. coli bacteria to humans. And the cellular machinery that all of these organisms, from E. coli to humans, use is almost identical. And when I'm talking about machinery, what I mean is the organelles, the cell membranes, the molecules that make up all of these different cells. And so from molecular biology, we've been able to glean the fact that because organisms such as E. coli and bacteria through humans are all using these same building blocks as well as the same basic processes, that's kind of the most compelling evidence for evolution, right? So these processes, these molecules evolved in single cells, like E. coli, and they have been tweaked and changed and evolved over time into the more complicated things that we see today. And additionally, there's a lot of similarity between the DNA of single-celled organisms, or the common ancestors, as there is with humans. And so that similarity between the genetic material as well as the processes that every single cell uses in order to stay alive are probably the strongest case that there was once a common ancestor and that evolution has taken place through natural selection over time.